So we're in class 91 of the Golden Doves, page 48. And it's going to be, I think, become perhaps a little more clear. So we're creating here new mental structures, new linguistic structures. We're dealing here with issues that are very arcane, not spoken about a lot, not thought about almost hardly, not cared about actually. And why would anybody care about this unless they want to gain wisdom? And here's the thing, that in order to achieve knowledge of God, the standard linguistic structures are useless. I don't want to say useless, let me take a step back. They're useful to a very, very, very limited degree, right? And language is limited by its nature, so that we need to create new forms, new modes, new concepts. And through these new modes, new forms, new concepts, we perhaps can gain a slightly closer understanding, closer to the truth, understanding of such profound matters. So while the process is naturally incredibly difficult, the rewards are quite great. So we're going to study the top paragraph in page 48. Speech and language can now be understood in terms of their respective functions. You have speech, which is the actual act of a first person speaking. And you have language, which is a system of words and the system of grammar and the system of syntax that allows for speech. The function of speech is presence. During the act of speech, there is an assertion of presence by the first person who's speaking. I am here. In active speech, I am here is always implied, right? If I say, pass me the ketchup, right? Anytime I say something as a first person to a second person, I am here is the implication, right? The function of language, or it's in the empty space. The syntax assumes I am here, right? Continuing. So that's what it means. The function of speech is presence. The function of language is representation. Speech has to do with the presence of the speaker. Language is just representation. It's symbols, right? The word banana represents a thing called a banana, right? The words cup of tea represent the cup of tea. In this case, I'm holding a cup of tea in my hand, but the words are not the cup of tea. The words are representing the cup of tea. And because of that, presence and representation are mutually exclusive, right? They're mutually exclusive in the sense that presence asserts a certain reality, right? Representation, a presence asserts a here and now reality. The word ani means here and now, right? Representation means that which is spoken of, which is not necessarily here and now. The words cup of tea are not the cup of tea, right? The word I actually asserts my presence here and now. So they're mutually exclusive. Presence is experience in dialectic reality of person, and I feel my presence most greatly when I can speak to a second person and they can understand me and they can reply to me. That's where my presence is most animated. So there's a dialectical relationship because I'm not that person, and yet he still hears me and understands my message, and then he asserts his presence to me. It is experience in the act of speech when the ego establishes subjectivity. And how does the ego establish subjectivity? By saying I. The interiority of the speaking subject excludes representation. Now think of that for example. So there's an interiority, that's what's happening in my mind. So what's happening in my mind, my subjectivity, is real, right? So there is a certain experience that I'm having, that excludes the idea of representation, because right now at this moment I am happy. Right now at this moment I am hungry, right? So there's a certain interiority. Right now at this moment I'm experiencing something, right? So that has to do with presence, but that presence has a concrete reality to it, whereas representation, right, is excluded by that. Right? Representation here does not imply, and I was going to make a clarification, because one reading this text may wish to understand the word representation in a Husserlian manner. So he says representation here does not imply a distinction between effective and fictitious language. So Husserl distinguishes between effective language and fictitious language. Effective language is language describing an actual, let's call it an objective or empirical reality. Paris is the capital of France. Water boils at the temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius. That's effective language. Fictitious language is things that have to do with feelings and emotions, similes, many metaphors, many analogies. In a land far away lived a evil witch, right? That would be fictitious language. But it doesn't have to be fictitious in the sense of it doesn't exist. It also fictitious, like for example, you say, the fog rolls on little cat's feet. I'm evoking a certain emotion of how I experience things, right? So that's the difference between effective and fictitious language. That's not what we're talking about here. A representing or reproducing of presence in the Husserlian sense. Again, Husserl, he speaks about representing and reproducing. So representation and reproduction. So representation would be, I take a photo of a place. I went to the beautiful forest hike, and after 45 minutes of hiking, I reached a beautiful lake. I take a photo. Now I have the photo, and I look at the photo. So the photo is a representation of the original experience, right? That's a few steps removed from the actual lake. That's just the photo. It's not the lake. Reproducing, again in the Husserlian sense, is to actually go to the lake. And now I try to reproduce the original experience of going to the lake. Of course, we never can reproduce the experience, right? You reproduce it, but it's not the original experience, right? Never is. Anyway, so representation here doesn't have to do with those things, right? Rather, it is meant as the articulation of that which is absent from the act of speech. So representation here means those things which are not part of the speech. Again, if I say apple, the actual apple is not part of the act of speaking apple, right? So representation in the sense of speaking words, right, that represent other things, right? They point out towards things that are not part of the speech, right? The word apple points out to an apple. It may be in front of me, it may be there, it may be far away, right? But the word apple is not apple. Remember, we reject magic. In magical thinking, the word apple and apple are somehow connected. So I'm just going to repeat that sentence and skip the interjection in the middle. Representation here means the articulation of that which is absent from the act of speech, right? So even when I said this cup of tea, it's almost empty now, I have to make another cup. But I said a cup of tea. The words, the act of speaking cup of tea are not the cup of tea. You see how? So they actually, you get the idea of representation, not in the Husserlian sense, but in the Faurian sense. So let's go back now to the beginning of the paragraph and see. Speech and language can now be understood there in terms of their respective functions. There's speech and there's language. There's parole and there's lan, right? The function of speech is present. So again, in speaking, ani, the word ani is me, right? It's not a representation, I, right? When I say I, here and now, it's actually me, because I assert myself through the word ani. If I wasn't able to speak the word ani, my subjectivity, my presence would not be affirmed, or rather not affirmed, but rather asserted, right? It is the expression of subjectivity to another person that creates subjectivity in the first place. So that's the idea of presence, right? The function of speech is presence, right? The function of language is representation. So in language, there is that two mutually exclusive domains. The words used to represent, and the objects or the things or the ideas which are being represented by the words. Those are two separate realms. In speech, the words of subjectivity are the actual subject, because it is at the moment of the expression of these words that the subject becomes a subject. It's really crazy stuff. Ani Adonai Elohechem asher hoseti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. That's God's subjectivity. Think about the name that God gives to Moshe Rabbeinu when Moshe Rabbeinu is in the burning bush. That's that, right? Think about that. It's worth opening up the book. I'm not going to tell you if you don't open up the book. Let's see how God calls himself. It has to do with presence, right? Right? So presence and representation are mutually exclusive, right? Mutually exclusive in the sense that they're two different things. Because in presence, the language ani, the word ani is the subject, right? So you don't have this bifurcation, right? Whereas in representation, the word apple is not the apple. Presence is experienced in the dialectic reality of person. It is experienced in the act of speech, when the ego establishes subjectivity, right? Again, because he is speaking, it is at that moment that he establishes his subjectivity, and hence there is a collapsing of the word ani with the actual ani. The interiority of the speaking subject excludes representation. Right. Representation here, and I'm just going to skip the Husserlian ideas, which are not what we're talking about, so I'm just going to kind of, right. Representation here means the articulation of that which is absent from the act of speech, as I noted already. That the way language works in structuralism is you have the signifier and the signified. The two things are different. The signifier is the word. The signifier is different, is not the same thing as the signified, right, which is the actual object. Accordingly, the very idea of the universe as a dynamic speech of God excludes the possibility of God's representation. So you have the universe, and the universe is God speaking. And you have these words, and these words refer to things. For example, "Vayomer Elohim yehi or." So the word or represents the or. So you have the whole universe. Different things that God is speaking. So there's a speech, and the speech contains language, which is a representation of things. So God creates gravity. God creates the entire cosmos and the galaxies and the stars. That's representation. That representation is separate from, by definition, the speaker. When I say, I want an apple, I am not the apple, right? There's a word which represents an apple. You can hear the word, you can see the apple. I'm not in either of those realms. I'm separate from the speech. So, when we listen to God's speech, we never have access to God as a subject. We only have access to God's speech, which is His creation, and we can behold His creation and see it and understand it. But that's not God. God is outside that realm, the same way the speaker is not part of the speech. The speaker can speak about himself, of course, right? But the speaker is not part of the speech, right? So again, the very idea of the universe is the dynamic speech of God, because God is always speaking the universe, right? Excludes the possibility of God's representation. Precisely because God is not part of the universe, how can He possibly be represented? That's crazy stuff, right? Because all there is the universe and God. God is not in the universe, so how can there be a representation of God? So this representation is of God's speech, not of God Himself. Hence you have Shem HaMeforash, right? Present, for those of you who might be studying the Moreh Nevuchim, you will now appreciate some of the things that I'm saying here. Presence and the two-directional function of speech are best illustrated by the Shema, the most important prayer in Jewish liturgy. It consists of 3 sections from the Pentateuch. There are several features. Wow, it feels incredible to read a sentence and not have to read the sentence 75 times to understand it. I just read these sentences, I didn't have to explain it. I think it was pretty clear. There are several features unique to this prayer. To begin with, it is the only liturgy consisting of biblical passages whose daily recitation is scripturally required by Jewish law. So the first thing is deoraita. There is a deoraita obligation, and this is the only case of a deoraita obligation to read Pesukim from the Torah, right? There is no other deoraita obligation to read daily recitation. Let me be more precise. Every day a person is obligated to read these Pesukim which come from the Torah. The purpose of the first section is that one should accept upon himself the yoke of heaven. Right? In Perek Hayah Koreh B'Torah, second chapter of Masechet Berachot, Kabbalat Or Malchut Shamayim, right? That is, what does it mean, Kabbalat Or Malchut Shamayim? The acceptance of God's authority. And my father discusses this in other writings, the idea of political authority of God over us. And I will stop here.